LPFM Salem. We're also streaming live online, for those of you who don't have a radio, at WRKE.org, a service of Roanoke College. Classic for tomorrow. Hope everyone had a great Easter weekend or Passover, if you celebrated Passover. Certainly was a good one for me, and lots of entertaining news, I guess. A lot of analysis that went on this weekend, but not too much in the name of kind of new news. Today primarily is going to be a slightly light show, but also discussing some kind of heavy events, depending on how you put it. Today we'll be discussing the death of a legend. For all you kids out there, I'll explain who Mike Wallace is. And then it seemed like the rhetoric got a little bit heated on the Sunday talk shows, discussing what happened with that. Plus, Sarah Palin was on the Today Show last week. Talk about exactly what that means, whether that helped or hurt the Today Show's cause. And then finally, today's kind of big idea, Andrew Sullivan discussing faith in Newsweek last week. I'll read a couple excerpts from that and explain my take on why I think this is important for all Christians to read. Andrew Sullivan is a gay Catholic who writes a blog called The Dish on the Daily Beast, and I think he has a lot to say on this subject. All right, it's time now to begin by discussing Mike Wallace. Mike Wallace, who officially died on Saturday at the age of 93. USA Today put it, he was on their cover, and it said, Wallace's death marks the end of old school era. And I think that certainly is something worth noting. He certainly was a legend in his own right. And the cover, I think, so eloquently puts it and shows him with the backdrop of 60 Minutes behind him, the famous ticking clock that you would hear for 60 Minutes almost every Sunday, for most Sundays. Actually, it was not on Sunday originally, but it became to be a staple of Sundays. You would be able to hear a weekly news magazine where Mike Wallace would do interviews, and there would be different news segments by various newscasters to talk about important issues of the day. Almost the first of its kind, and something worthwhile talking about. It's not something that I think everyone really watches anymore, and the average age probably drinks Metamucil and listens to polka music, but I still think it has a certain currency within the news community. It changed the way we look at news, and I think was vitally important. The man basically was a very innovative journalist. He was somebody who could really bring an interview together and ask tough questions, and at the same time really get to the heart of the matter. He was the host of 60 Minutes for 38 consecutive seasons. Before that, he was in radio. He was in radio, old-time radio and broadcasting as a news journalist. He basically helped found 60 Minutes on CBS in 1968, and like I said, it would take these kind of 15-minute news segments, and they would discuss particular stories. It's still on the air. Actually, some of it's early. It has a lot of older newscasters, but still very seasoned newscasters who know how to bring the news. Wallace was a sharp-tongued interviewer. If anyone remembers most of his interviews, they would be often interviews that would make people very, very uncomfortable. He ended up winning like 21 Emmys or something unprecedented like that for his news reporting. He would do things, I think, that most people don't always think about. Some of the subjects were unfazed by Wallace. They were unfazed by some of his questions, but nevertheless, he would make people rather uncomfortable when he would talk about it. A very famous story/interviews Mike Wallace did on 60 Minutes. He had Ayatollah Khomeini just after the hostages were taken. He was allowed into Iran to interview the famous Ayatollah Khomeini, who would be named the supreme leader of Iran in 1979. And he brought up this kind of famous phrase that Anwar Sadat, the president of Egypt, who he said, quote, Wallace says to the Imam, I'll just read this verbatim. He says, Mr. Ayatollah, he calls you imam. Forgive me, in his words, not mine, a lunatic. And the translator, Blanche, but the Ayatollah responded calmly, calling Sadat a heretic. And Wallace apparently said, he said, what's the worst that could happen to me? I could get thrown in jail, I guess, for this. So he just asked this question point blank, and it was something that was quite shocking. He also was someone who was very famous, at least in the early shows, for smoking in the studio. This is back in the day when you could. I would say that he would be up there with some of the old-time media people for being able to kind of do this. He got in trouble and sued by General Westmoreland, the famous general from Vietnam, for libel after he basically said that he underestimated the amount of kind of troops that were needed on the ground in Vietnam for political reasons, and Westmoreland was not particularly happy about that. Ultimately, the case was dropped by Westmoreland, but in the end, it was something that really rocked, I think the news. Another famous interview that he did with John Ehrlichman, who was kind of Richard Nixon's, what they call Nixon's kind of right-hand man. I think he wasn't chief of staff for Nixon, but he was someone who was very instrumental in the Watergate break-in. And this is what Wallace basically did to start the interview. He says, quote, with plans to audit tax returns for political retaliation, theft of psychiatric records, spying on undercover agents, conspiracy to obstruct justice, all of this by the Law and Order Administration of Richard Nixon. And Mr. Ehrlichman just stares at him and says, is there a question involved in this? And Wallace says, no, there isn't. I just wanted to point all these things out. So Wallace was always someone who was able to go after those and make people uncomfortable. In fact, my favorite quote comes from Morty Safer, who was a fellow who worked on 60 Minutes, still does, and knew Wallace quite well. He says, Wallace took to heart the old reporter's pledge to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. Others, such as Bob Schaefer, who hosts Face the Nation on CBS on Sunday morning, said, Mike was a good friend and a mentor to me. He even gave me a compliment once, and it was one of the real pioneers in television journalism. My all-time favorite, though, comes from Ann Curry, who tweeted this weekend, tough questions are being asked in heaven today. R.I.P. Mike Wallace. He will be someone who he will be severely missed. He worked up until his 80s working on 60 Minutes, basically because he said, I couldn't stop. I just had to keep on reporting. And surely he did do that. I should mention that Wallace has a son out there his name is Chris Wallace. He hosts Fox News Sunday, and this is of course a very sad tragedy for him as his father. It's something that it's certainly very hard, I think, to be in the industry when you have such a legend that you have to look up to and work with. The final thing that I'll say on this is that this is a college radio station, so a lot of people probably don't watch 60 Minutes, but this man, with the headline, of course, saying the end of an old school era, it certainly may be the end of that, but he made the way and paved the way, I think, for investigative journalism to really come into its being. There was not a show like this that was on television that took news in this light. You had 30-minute news segments at night where you would have Walter Cronkite. Before that, you'd have people like Edwin R. Murrow and, of course, Dan Rather and Tom Brokaw and others who would come on the air and give these news segments, but you wouldn't have the type of in-depth coverage that you see here. You would get this from newspapers, maybe, but it's certainly the news magazines. We know it today. Now there's a ton of them. You see these stories all the time. Was revolutionized by Mr. Mike Wallace. So Mike Wallace died on Saturday at the age of 93. Very sad story. Very sad story. All right, it's now 12 minutes past the top of the hour here on WRKE. We're going to take just a kind of a short break, but before that, this Friday is going to be the start of a alumni weekend, and there will be bingo that will happen in the gym. I assume it's going to happen. I think it's going to happen in the alumni gym at 9 o'clock. Open to all students and alumni who would like to come, so please come out for that. It's sponsored by CAB, so please come out to bingo this week to kick off alumni weekend here at Roanoke College. We'll be right back with more In the Know, talking about some discussions about on the Sunday talk shows about the future of Christianity and where people think it's going. Also, Andrew Sullivan's remarks in Newsweek and what those mean for Christianity as well. You're listening to In the Know, the once-a-week show that discusses politics and current events here on WRKE 100.3 FM.